The television turned itself on at exactly 3:17 in the afternoon. I was alone in the house. Daniel was supposed to be downtown meeting investors, and the only sound in our Charleston living room was the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant crash of the Atlantic against the seawall behind our property. I almost ignored the flicker of light from the screen, assuming it was another software glitch from the security system. Then I heard my husband's voice. Calm, measured, confident. Once Clara's inheritance clears probate, it's practically ours, he said. I froze where I stood. On the screen, the home security camera feed showed Daniel sitting in his office upstairs, the late afternoon sun cutting across his desk. He had a glass in his hand. Ice clinked softly as he shifted in his chair. She won't question the transfer structure, he continued. It's already arranged. There was another man in the room, just out of full view. I could see the edge of a tailored navy sleeve, a watch glinting when he leaned forward. I'm promising you the entire thing, Daniel said. The house, the shares, all of it. My inheritance. Promised. Like it was his to give. The worst part wasn't the words. It was the tone. He sounded relaxed, almost amused. Like this was a done deal. Like the conversation existed safely in private. He had no idea the security system auto-played motion alerts when the house detected activity earlier in the day. He had no idea I was standing there, listening to every word. My hand tightened around the edge of the sofa as the recording continued. After Christmas, Daniel added, swirling the ice in his glass. We finalize it. Everyone will be distracted. It'll feel seamless. The other man chuckled softly. And she won't interfere. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. She trusts me. That sentence hit harder than the promise. I stepped closer to the television, my pulse pounding in my ears. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it had been recorded barely 2 hours earlier. Daniel had been home. In our house? In his office overlooking the harbor. I grabbed the remote and rewound the clip, raising the volume. The second voice became clearer. Once probate clears, the man said, you'll hold majority leverage. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Exactly. Majority leverage. Over what? I knew the answer before he said it. Whitmore Maritime Logistics. My grandfather's company, the one my grandmother had protected for decades. Refusing private equity offers. Refusing mergers. Refusing to let anyone outside the family control it. The shares she placed into a trust before she died last month. The shares now moving through probate before being transferred fully into my name. The historic coastal property was part of it too. The house on Sullivan's Island that had been in our family for 3 generations. The one Daniel once called illiquid sentiment. On the screen, Daniel's expression sharpened. Once I'm majority holder, the board won't resist restructuring. Restructuring. The word felt clinical, detached. The other man shifted fully into frame for just a second as he reached across the desk to slide a folder toward Daniel. Gregory Hale, managing partner of Harbor Crest Capital. I felt the air leave my lungs. Gregory had tried to acquire minority shares in our company years ago. My grandmother shut him down personally. I remembered the way she described him at dinner afterward. Polished, persistent, predatory, and now he was in my house. I replayed the moment again, watching Gregory's hand push the folder forward. Daniel opened it without hesitation. We just need her signature on the amendment, Daniel said. Temporary voting rights during probate. Clean and simple. Amendment. My mind raced back over the last few weeks. Daniel insisting on reviewing estate documents, suggesting we streamline leadership, leaving a packet on my desk labeled Routine Estate Optimization. Had that been it? On the recording. Gregory lowered his voice. And she doesn't know. Daniel laughed softly. She hates conflict. She'll sign to keep things smooth. Heat flooded my face. Not from embarrassment. From recognition. He wasn't just planning a transfer. He was counting on my personality. The video continued to play, but I could barely hear it over the rush of blood in my ears. I paused the screen and leaned closer. On Daniel's desk, partially visible beneath the folder, was another document. White paper, bold header. Postnuptial asset reclassification draft. My name typed neatly below. I had never agreed to any postnuptial revision. I stood there in the center of our living room. The late afternoon light stretching across the hardwood floors. The ocean wind pressing faintly against the windows. Upstairs, Daniel's office door was now closed and empty. The house was quiet again. But something fundamental had shifted. I rewound the footage one last time. Gregory stepped fully into frame, adjusting his cufflinks. His expression calm and confident. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. It was coordinated. It was structured. And as I stared at the frozen image of my husband promising my inheritance like it was a business asset, I realized something even more unsettling. They weren't just planning to take control of my inheritance. They were planning to take control of my entire life. I didn't move for a long time after I froze the frame on Gregory Hale's face. The television cast a cold glow across the living room, illuminating the polished floors. The framed photographs of my grandparents. The careful life Daniel and I had built inside these walls. Gregory stood there on the screen like he belonged in my house. Like he had always belonged there. Managing partner of Harborcrest Capital, the same private equity firm that had once tried to buy its way into Whitmore Maritime Logistics. My grandmother had refused them without blinking. And now Gregory was sitting in my husband's office, discussing my inheritance like it was an acquisition target. I pressed play again. After Christmas. We finalize it, Daniel said in the recording. Gregory's voice followed, smooth and controlled. And her family won't interfere. Daniel didn't hesitate. Her stepmother already understands the long-term vision. My breath caught. Elaine. I replayed that sentence twice to make sure I hadn't misheard it. Her stepmother already understands. Understands what? That my inheritance was about to be redirected. That Daniel was positioning himself to gain majority leverage in my family business. I muted the television and reached for my phone. My hands were steady now. Not shaking. Not panicked. Steady. I searched my email inbox and found the message from the probate attorney that had arrived earlier that week. Your spouse attended the preliminary review session. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Daniel was my husband. Of course he would show up. That was what supportive spouses did. But the attorney had addressed the follow-up questions to him. Questions about restructuring timelines. Questions about amendment drafts. I hadn't authorized him to represent me. Under South Carolina law, he could attend, but he couldn't negotiate structural changes without my consent. Unless he expected to get it. I unmuted the television and let the recording continue. She still thinks this is about legacy, Daniel said lightly. Gregory laughed. The sound made my stomach turn. Legacy. Whitmore Maritime Logistics wasn't just a company. It was my grandfather's life's work. He built it from a single shipping contract into a regional logistics operation that spanned 3 ports. My grandmother fought off investors who wanted to dilute ownership. She believed in control, in independence. Daniel once called that old-fashioned, liquidity matters more than sentiment. He had told me over dinner last year. At the time, I thought he was talking about market cycles. Now I knew better. I walked to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. Within minutes, I was inside the South Carolina Business Registry database. Harborcrest Capital appeared first. Then I searched Daniel's name. A new entity surfaced almost immediately. Whitmore Coastal Holdings, LLC. My chest tightened. The name was close enough to my grandmother's trust to cause confusion. Close enough to sound legitimate in conversation. Registered 2 weeks after her funeral. I clicked into the filing details. Registered manager, Daniel Whitmore. Mailing address, Harborcrest Capital's downtown office. Purpose classification, Maritime Asset Management and Restructuring. Restructuring. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't a conversation that had drifted into ambition. It was paperwork. Registration. Strategy. My phone buzzed in my hand, making me flinch. Owen. I hesitated before answering. Hey, he said, sounding unusually upbeat. Daniel mentioned something about bringing me into the company after the holidays. My stomach dropped. What exactly did he say? I asked carefully. That you wanted fresh energy and leadership. That it's time for transition planning. He laughed lightly. I mean, I know I'm younger, but I appreciate the vote of confidence. I closed my eyes. I had never told Daniel I wanted a leadership transition. I had never told Owen that I felt overwhelmed. Those words weren't mine. They're talking about restructuring, Owen added. Daniel said it's all aligned. Aligned. With whom? Did he say anything about probate? I asked. Just that it's a formality. Once it clears, things move quickly. Once it clears. The same phrase Daniel had used in the recording. I ended the call with Owen and sat in silence for a moment. Then I opened our joint banking account. Several transfers caught my attention immediately. Consulting retainers. Strategic advisory fees. The recipient firm traced back to Harbor Crest's legal counsel. Daniel wasn't just talking. He was financing. The dates aligned perfectly with Gregory's visits to our house. I returned to the security footage archive and scrolled backward through the last month. 3 separate visits from Gregory. Each time when I was out, at a board meeting, visiting the Charleston port office, having dinner with Elaine. In one clip, I noticed something else. Elaine's car in the driveway an hour before Gregory arrived. The 3 of them inside my house. Without me, my pulse slowed instead of quickened. Shock was fading. In its place, something colder was settling in. On the screen, I paused another segment of the footage. Gregory leaned forward and asked, "And you're certain she won't resist?" Daniel smiled. "She trusts me. She always has." I stared at his face on the frozen screen. Trust? He had counted on it, built his strategy around it. And for the first time since the television turned itself on that afternoon, I stopped feeling blindsided. I started feeling strategic. Daniel acted like nothing had changed the next morning. He stood at the kitchen counter in a pressed navy suit, scrolling through his phone while the coffee machine hissed. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching the silver in his watch. He looked composed, rested. "Did you see the probate update?" he asked casually. "We should talk about consolidating leadership before the holidays." Consolidating leadership. The phrase slid into the air between us like it belonged there. "I saw the email," I said evenly. He nodded, satisfied, and took a sip of coffee. "It'll make things cleaner. Less confusion for the board." Cleaner. Less confusion. I watched him differently now. Not as my husband standing in our kitchen, but as a man who had already drafted paperwork to reposition my inheritance. After he left for work, I opened my laptop again. Whitmore Coastal Holdings, LLC. The name still made my jaw tighten. I pulled up the filing history in more detail. The formation date was exactly 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. Not a day earlier. Not a day later. Grief had barely settled, and Daniel had already registered a company built around my family's name. The registered address matched Harbor Crest Capital's office downtown. There was also a pending filing attached to the LLC. I clicked it open. Asset integration proposal following marital restructuring. Marital restructuring. The words felt sterile and surgical, like someone describing the removal of a tumor. I checked our joint bank account again and cross-referenced the dates of the transfers. Strategic advisory retainer. Legal structuring consultation. Corporate integration planning. Each transfer corresponded with a day Gregory's car had appeared in our driveway. This wasn't a hypothetical plan. It was funded. My phone rang again. Owen. "Hey," he said, sounding slightly more hesitant than yesterday. "Daniel sent me some documents. Draft organization charts. Potential leadership shifts. Leadership shifts. Did he say I approved them?" I asked. There was a pause. "He said you were open to it." "Open to it?" "I never agreed to any restructuring," I said quietly. Owen hesitated again. He made it sound like you wanted someone you could trust inside operations. Trust. The word felt distorted now. "I'll call you later," I told him. When I hung up, I went upstairs to Daniel's office. The room smelled faintly of his cologne and polished wood. His desk was clean. Almost too clean. I opened the bottom drawer carefully. There it was. The packet he had left on my desk days ago. Routine estate optimization. I sat in his leather chair and flipped through the pages slowly this time. Temporary voting rights transfer during probate. Operational authority in the event of administrative delay. Spousal oversight clause. Each section was framed as efficiency, protection, partnership. But buried in the language was something else. Interim voting authority granted to spouse until final trust distribution. If I had signed this without reading carefully, Daniel would have controlled the company before the inheritance even fully transferred to me. My stomach tightened. There was a sticky note on the signature page. Signed before Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. The same holiday he had referenced in the recording. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought about my grandmother sitting at this very desk years ago, reviewing contracts with a pen in her hand and a pair of reading glasses balanced on her nose. She never signed anything she didn't understand. She used to say control isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Daniel didn't see it that way. For him, control was leverage. I returned to the security footage and scrolled through older clips. One caught my eye immediately. Elaine's car pulling into the driveway. An hour later, Gregory's sedan followed. The three of them entered the house together. I fast-forwarded to the office camera. Daniel handing Elaine a folder. The same color as the post-nuptial draft I had seen on his desk. Post-nuptial asset reclassification draft. My name typed beneath it. I had never discussed a post-nuptial agreement with him. Not once. I opened the state registry page again and refreshed it. The pending filing under Daniel's LLC now displayed a projected execution window, effective upon marital restructuring completion. The words stared back at me from the screen. Marital restructuring. Not just asset management. Not just inheritance leverage. He was preparing to reshape our marriage around control. The realization didn't break me the way I thought it might. It sharpened something. Daniel believed this was a quiet takeover. A clean, seamless transition that would happen while everyone was distracted by holiday dinners and family traditions. He believed I would sign to avoid conflict. He believed I would trust him. I closed the laptop slowly and sat in the silence of his office. For the first time since the television turned itself on, I didn't feel shocked. I felt focused. If Daniel wanted to play majority holder, he had miscalculated one thing. I had just become aware of the game. And I had no intention of being the last to move. I scheduled the meeting with Lydia Mercer the next morning before Daniel finished his first conference call. Her office overlooked the Charleston harbor, all glass and dark wood. Quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I brought printed screenshots of the security footage, copies of the amendment draft, and the filing details for Whitmore Coastal Holdings. Lydia read everything without interrupting. When she reached the page about temporary voting rights during probate, she looked up at me over her glasses. If you had signed this, she said calmly, he would have had operational control within 30 days. 30 days. I kept my hands folded in my lap so she wouldn't see how tightly they were clenched. He presented it as routine, I said. Administrative efficiency. She gave a small, knowing nod. It's structured to look cooperative. But it shifts leverage. Leverage. The same word Daniel had used in the recording. Lydia requested the full trust documentation my grandmother had established years earlier. I had digital copies, but she asked for the certified version as well. She read through the original clauses slowly, pausing only once. There's something here, she said. She turned the document so I could see the paragraph she was pointing at. Any spouse who attempts to coerce, redirect, or improperly influence trust assets may be subject to automatic exclusion review upon documented evidence of intent. My heart beat steadily, not wildly. Documented evidence of intent. I had a recording. He assumed you wouldn't know what you were signing, Lydia said quietly. I thought about Daniel's confidence in that office chair. The way he had laughed. He assumed I wouldn't look closely, I replied. Lydia's expression didn't change. The exclusion clause isn't automatic. It requires proof and formal notice. But the recording strengthens your position significantly. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since the television turned itself on, I felt something close to balance. Do I confront him? I asked. She shook her head immediately. Not yet. If he suspects exposure, he could accelerate filings, move funds, apply pressure. We document first? Document first. I slid the postnuptial draft across the desk. She skimmed it quickly, her brow tightening. This language attempts to blur separate and marital property, she said. Interim authority in case of administrative delay. That's not neutral language. It was on his desk, I said. With my name already typed? Lydia flipped to the last page. There's a digital timestamp embedded in the draft file, she noted. That suggests it's already been circulated electronically. Circulated. My stomach tightened. We discussed Harbor Crest Capital next. Lydia had already pulled preliminary financial data. Increased debt exposure, she said. Pending investor disputes. Liquidity pressure. Gregory didn't just want growth. He needed collateral. If your husband gained majority leverage over Whitmore Maritime Logistics, Lydia continued, those shares could be used strategically. Used. Like tools. Like bargaining chips. I sat back in the chair, staring out at the harbor for a moment. Boats moved slowly across the water, unaware of corporate maneuvers happening behind closed doors. He mentioned Christmas in the recording, I said. After Christmas. We finalize it. Lydia nodded. Holiday windows are common. Distraction lowers scrutiny. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks away. The timing wasn't sentimental. It was tactical. What about third parties? I asked carefully. If someone outside the marriage encouraged this, you're referring to your stepmother. I didn't answer immediately. If she knowingly assisted, Lydia said, she could face exposure depending on her involvement. Exposure. The word lingered between us. I had spent years trying to maintain peace in the family. Smooth conversations. Avoid conflict. Protect harmony. Daniel had counted on that. But harmony built on deception wasn't harmony at all. We finalized immediate precautionary steps. Formal notice to probate clarifying my independent representation. A temporary advisory restriction requiring dual attorney review for any amendment. Notification to the company's governance board that no voting rights were authorized to shift. Daniel would not be informed yet. When I returned home that afternoon, he was already in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. How was your day? He asked lightly. Productive, I said. He studied my face for a second, as if searching for something. Doubt. Suspicion. He found none. I was thinking, I said casually, setting my bag down. Maybe we should host Thanksgiving this year. He blinked once, surprised. At our place? Yes, I said. It's been a while since we had everyone here. A slow smile spread across his face. That's perfect timing, he said. Perfect timing. He thought proximity meant control. He thought the holiday would mask the transition. That night, after he went to bed, I opened my laptop one more time. A secure email from Lydia had arrived. Attached was a public filing request document tied to Daniel's LLC. Projected effective date for asset integration. December 26th. The day after Christmas. He wasn't planning a conversation. He was planning a transfer. And he believed the holidays would keep me too distracted to notice. I stayed up past midnight with headphones on, listening to every second of the security recording. Not just the clip the system auto-played, but the full audio export from that afternoon. I sat at my grandmother's old desk with a legal pad in front of me, writing down timestamps and exact phrases, forcing myself to hear it all without flinching. Once I hold majority leverage, the board won't resist. Daniel said clearly at one point, majority leverage, not partnership, not shared authority. Control. Gregory's voice followed. Lower. Cautious. And you're sure she won't fight it? Daniel didn't even pause. She avoids conflict. She'll sign to keep peace. The words were clinical. Observational. Like he was describing a market trend instead of his wife. She still thinks this is about legacy, Daniel added. Gregory laughed softly. I pressed my pen harder against the paper, the ink cutting deeper into the page. Legacy. Whitmore Maritime Logistics had been built one contract at a time. My grandfather spent decades at the port, shaking hands, negotiating shipments, building trust with families who had worked those docks for generations. My grandmother had taken over after he died, defending the company against buyout attempts that promised easy expansion and faster liquidity. Legacy wasn't sentiment. It was responsibility. The recording continued. After Christmas dinner, we finalize it, Daniel said. Everyone will be relaxed, distracted. It'll feel seamless, Gregory responded. And the amendment, she'll sign, Daniel said. I'll frame it as temporary efficiency during probate. Temporary? Efficiency. The words were chosen carefully. They won't expect a public confrontation, Gregory added. Clean transitions don't create noise. Clean noise. I closed my eyes briefly. They weren't planning a discussion. They were planning a silent shift. Then Gregory's tone sharpened slightly. Once you consolidate the voting rights, Harborcrest can position the assets properly. Assets. My inheritance reduced to a category on a spreadsheet. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I could hear it in the creak of leather. Once I'm majority holder, we restructure board leadership. It won't take long. He didn't say we. He said I rewound that section and listened again. Once I'm majority holder. It wasn't about stabilizing the family business. It was about positioning himself as its center. Gregory's next words made my breath catch. And her stepmother. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Elaine understands stability matters more than sentiment. Stability. Sentiment. I wrote the words down slowly. Elaine understood. Understood what? That Daniel intended to redirect control. That he planned to move the company under his operational authority. And Owen? Gregory asked. Owen will follow wherever she leads, Daniel replied. He's eager. He wants a role. So that was the mentorship offer. Not generosity. Alignment. They were building internal legitimacy before announcing control. If my own brother supported the transition, the board might assume family unity. I removed the headphones for a moment and stared at the dark window in front of me. The harbor was invisible at that hour. Only the faint outline of dock lights in the distance. I put the headphones back on. Near the end of the recording, I heard the sound of papers sliding across the desk. This is the draft, Gregory said. Post-nuptial reclassification aligns cleanly with asset integration. Post-nuptial reclassification, Daniel responded calmly. Once she signs, everything consolidates. No friction. No friction. Like I was an obstacle to be smoothed out. Then I heard something else. A notification tone. Daniel's phone. Retainer clears on the 23rd, he said casually. Final structuring before the holidays. I opened our banking app again, checking the scheduled transfer. December 23rd. 3 days before the asset integration filing date Lydia had uncovered. This wasn't ambition. It was choreography. I finished transcribing the final lines of the recording. Gregory's voice softened. You're certain she won't resist? Daniel laughed quietly. She trusts me. She always has. I removed the headphones and set them on the desk carefully. Trust. He had built the entire strategy on that single assumption. That I would sign to avoid confrontation. That I would prioritize harmony over scrutiny. That I would never imagine my own husband promising my inheritance to someone else with a smile. I looked at my grandmother's portrait on the far wall. Her eyes were steady, unflinching. She had protected the company from outside investors for decades. She had never anticipated that the attempt would come from inside my own marriage. I picked up my phone and forwarded the full transcript to Lydia. Within minutes, she responded. This establishes documented intent. Her next message followed quickly. Do you want to stop this quietly? Or do you want it exposed? I leaned back in the chair and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the window. Thanksgiving was less than 2 weeks away. The house would be full. Family gathered under one roof. Daniel believed the holidays would shield his transfer. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling something shift into place inside me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about saving my marriage. I was thinking about setting the table. Thanksgiving morning arrived bright and deceptively peaceful. I woke before sunrise and lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe. The ocean wind pressed softly against the windows. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed. Nothing about the quiet hinted at betrayal, leverage, or asset integration. Daniel was still asleep beside me, one arm thrown across the mattress. Relaxed. After tonight, everything will feel settled. That was what he had said earlier in the week. He thought settled meant controlled. I slipped out of bed and walked through the house slowly. Deliberately, I checked the living room television. I opened the security app on my phone and confirmed the footage was cued exactly where I needed it. One tap would be enough. By 8, Daniel was downstairs in a pressed sweater, slicing citrus for the table like a man hosting an ordinary family dinner. "You're in a good mood," he said lightly, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "I am," I answered truthfully, because clarity felt better than confusion. Gregory arrived first. He stepped inside with polished ease, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than our monthly electric bill. He greeted Daniel warmly, shook my hand with steady confidence. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said, as if he hadn't promised to restructure my life 2 weeks earlier. Elaine followed shortly after, wrapped in a tailored coat, her perfume sharp and familiar. She hugged me too tightly. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "With everything going on financially." Financially, the word was deliberate. "I'm doing well," I said evenly. Owen arrived last, nervous energy radiating off him. He smiled at Daniel first, then at me. We gathered around the dining table as the sun dipped lower outside. Silverware clinked. Candles flickered. The room smelled like rosemary and roasted turkey. I chose the seating carefully. Daniel on my right, Gregory directly across from me, Elaine beside him, Owen at the far end. Lydia sat quietly near my left, introduced simply as a friend from Charleston. Daniel poured wine and lifted his glass. "To family," he said smoothly. "And to new beginnings." "New beginnings." Gregory smiled faintly. Conversation drifted toward the company before dessert. Gregory mentioned growth opportunities. Daniel spoke about modernization. Elaine nodded approvingly. "Some legacies need decisive leadership," Gregory said casually, cutting into his food. My fork paused midair. "Decisive leadership," I repeated softly. Daniel didn't look at me. Owen cleared his throat. Daniel was telling me about potential leadership transitions after the holidays. Transitions. Daniel smiled modestly. "We're just exploring options. Stability matters." He glanced at Elaine when he said it. I felt the room tightening, threads of alliance weaving themselves visibly now that I knew how to look. Gregory leaned back in his chair. "Post-holiday transitions are often the cleanest." Clean. That word again. "Transition to what?" "Exactly," I asked lightly. A flicker passed between Daniel and Gregory. "Operational consolidation." Gregory answered too quickly. Lydia remained silent, watching. After dessert, I stood and smoothed my dress. "Let's move to the living room," I said. "I want to show you something about the security system. It's been glitching lately." Daniel stiffened almost imperceptibly. We settled onto the sofas. The ocean beyond the windows was dark now. The house lit warmly from within. I picked up the remote. "The system autoplays motion alerts sometimes," I said casually. "It startled me the other day." I tapped the screen. The television flickered. Then Daniel's voice filled the room. "Once Clara's inheritance clears probate, it's practically ours." Silence dropped like a weight. On the screen, Daniel sat in his office. Gregory's shoulder appeared in frame. "She won't question the transfer structure," Daniel continued. "It's already arranged." Gregory's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. "I'm promising you the entire thing," Daniel said on the recording. The house. The shares. All of it. No one moved. Elaine's hand trembled slightly against her wine glass. Owen looked from the screen to Daniel, confusion turning into something sharper. Daniel stood abruptly. Clara, the recording kept playing. After Christmas. We finalize it. I let it run just long enough. Then I paused it. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Lydia set her glass down calmly. For clarity, she said evenly. I represent Clara Whitmore regarding her inheritance and trust protection. Daniel stared at her like he hadn't noticed her presence all evening. Gregory shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. This is being taken out of context, Daniel said, his voice low but controlled. I met his eyes. You weren't planning partnership, I said quietly. You were planning control. Gregory leaned toward Daniel and whispered something urgent. Elaine finally found her voice. Clara, let's not overreact. Overreact? Lydia's tone remained measured. This recording establishes documented intent. Daniel looked at me differently now. Not like a wife. Like an obstacle. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. He had believed the takeover plan was completely safe. He had believed the conversation existed only in private. He had believed I would never hear it. He was wrong. The room stayed silent long after the recording stopped playing. The last words, I'm promising you the entire thing, hung in the air like something physical. Something heavy enough to press against all of us. Daniel was the first to move. You took this out of context, he said quietly. His voice was controlled. But I could see it in his jaw. The tension. The calculation. Gregory shifted in his seat but didn't speak. Out of context? I asked. My tone steady. Daniel stood slowly. This was strategic planning. You're reacting emotionally to business language. Emotionally. Lydia folded her hands calmly in her lap. Mr. Whitmore. The recording establishes documented intent to redirect trust assets without the beneficiary's informed consent. Daniel's eyes snapped toward her. And you are Lydia Mercer. Estate litigation. The air shifted again. This is absurd, Daniel said, looking back at me. You're turning a private discussion into a public spectacle. Private. You promised my inheritance to another man in my house. Gregory cleared his throat. Clara. This was exploratory. Nothing was finalized. I met his eyes. You discussed majority leverage. Board restructuring. Asset integration. That's not exploratory. Daniel stepped closer to me. You don't understand how fragile the company is right now. Harbor Crest could stabilize it. My family built it without Harbor Crest, I replied. He exhaled sharply. Your grandmother resisted modernization. Times change. And so do marriages, I said quietly. Elaine finally spoke from the far side of the room. Clara, don't overreact. Daniel was thinking long-term. Stability matters. I turned toward her slowly. Did you know? Her hesitation lasted less than a second. But it was enough. I knew there were discussions, she said carefully. It's practical. Practical. You were planning to shift control of my inheritance without telling me, I said. That's not practical. That's betrayal. Owen looked pale. Daniel told me you agreed, he said suddenly. He said you wanted a transition. Daniel's head snapped toward him. Owen, you said she felt overwhelmed. Owen continued, his voice rising. You said she wanted support. The silence that followed felt sharper than the recording. Daniel didn't answer. Lydia stood then, smooth and composed. She placed a folder on the coffee table. These are the LLC filings, she said. Whitmore Coastal Holdings. Registered 2 weeks after Mrs. Whitmore's grandmother passed. Daniel's eyes flicked to the documents. And this, Lydia continued, sliding another page forward, is the pending asset integration proposal effective December 26th. Gregory's face lost color. That's standard contingency planning, he muttered. Funded by marital accounts, Lydia replied. Strategic retainers tied to Harbor Crest Council. Daniel looked at me again, and something in his expression hardened. You've been spying on me. The security system autoplayed, I said. You were careless. His voice dropped. You're blowing up our marriage over a conversation. No, I answered. You blew it up when you promised what wasn't yours. He laughed once, bitterly. You think a judge will see this your way? This will get messy. There's an exclusion clause in the trust, Lydia said calmly. Documented intent to manipulate assets triggers review. We're filing formal notice in the morning. Gregory swore under his breath. Daniel stared at me. You're really doing this? Yes. You think you've won? The question wasn't shouted. It was low, tight with pride. I held his gaze. I didn't win tonight, I said. I protected what was never yours. Elaine stood abruptly. This doesn't have to escalate. It already has, I replied. Owen looked between us. Shaken. I didn't know, he said quietly. I believe you. I told him. Daniel's shoulders rose and fell slowly as if he were trying to recalibrate. The confidence from the recording was gone. The man who had promised my inheritance like a transaction now looked cornered. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I answered. I made one when I trusted you without reading the fine print. Lydia gathered her documents. We'll be filing for divorce tomorrow, she said matter-of-factly. The word divorce settled into the room with finality. Daniel's expression flickered. Shock. Anger. Something close to fear. You'd destroy everything because of this, he asked. You tried to transfer everything because of this, I replied. Gregory stood first, smoothing his jacket. We'll be in touch, he said stiffly. I'm sure you will, Lydia responded. Elaine left without meeting my eyes. Owen lingered for a moment, then followed her. That left Daniel and me standing in the living room where the autoplay had first revealed the truth. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've changed. I shook my head slowly. No, I finally saw clearly. For a second, I almost recognized the man I married beneath the anger. But the version of him on that screen, confident, amused, promising my inheritance, was impossible to forget. You think this is over? He asked. It's just beginning, I said. He held my gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. The house fell quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel like shock. It felt like the collapse of something that had been unstable for a long time. And I wasn't the one who had pushed it. I woke up the morning after Thanksgiving expecting to feel shattered. Instead, I felt steady. Daniel's side of the closet was half empty. A few suits were gone, along with his leather overnight bag. He hadn't left a note. He hadn't tried to wake me. The silence in the bedroom wasn't heavy. It was clean. I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty hangers. For weeks, he had been planning a takeover of my inheritance, of my family business, of the authority my grandmother protected her entire life. And he had done it with the confidence of a man who believed he would never be questioned. But now the plan was exposed. And I wasn't the one packing a bag. By 9 that morning, I was sitting in Lydia's office again, signing formal documents. Notice triggering the exclusion clause review. Motion to freeze any pending asset integration filings. Petition for divorce, citing financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. The language was precise, cold, clinical, but underneath it was something simple. He tried to promise what wasn't his. Lydia looked at me after I signed the last page. He'll respond quickly, she said. But his leverage is limited now. Limited. Without majority voting rights. Without access to the trust. Without the ability to move assets quietly before Christmas. Daniel's strategy had depended on secrecy. Secrecy was gone. By the afternoon, I called an emergency advisory meeting for Whitmore Maritime Logistics. The board members joined by video, their faces tense and confused. I didn't dramatize it. I presented facts. Unauthorized LLC formation using a derivative of our company name. Pending asset integration filing. Recorded discussion of restructuring without beneficiary consent. There was silence when I finished. Then one of the senior board members, a man who had worked with my grandfather for 30 years, leaned closer to his camera. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said. The words hit deeper than I expected. We voted unanimously to reinforce governance protocols and restrict any external restructuring proposals until further notice. Majority control remained secured under the trust. Harbor Crest Capital's pending interest in strategic collaboration was quietly withdrawn within 48 hours. They didn't want discovery. They didn't want scrutiny. They didn't want a courtroom examining a recording where Daniel promised my inheritance like a transaction. Elaine called that evening. Her tone was tight, carefully composed. "You're escalating this unnecessarily," she said. Daniel was trying to modernize things. He was trying to control them. I replied, "Stability matters, not if it's built on deception." There was a long pause on the line. "You're dividing the family," she said finally. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm drawing a boundary." When I hung up, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. Owen came by the next day. He looked younger somehow, less confident. "I didn't know the full scope," he said quietly. "He told me you agreed." "I know," I said. "I feel stupid." "You were flattered," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He hesitated before asking, "Do you still trust me?" I didn't lie. "Trust isn't automatic anymore," I said gently. "But it can be rebuilt." He nodded. That was more honesty than I had received in weeks. Daniel's attorney sent a formal response 2 days later, suggesting marital contribution entitled him to partial consideration. Lydia responded with evidence of documented intent to manipulate trust assets. The tone shifted quickly. Negotiation replaced confidence. Threats softened. Without majority leverage. Without clean documentation. Without my signature on the amendment. His position was weaker than he expected. I returned to my grandmother's study that evening and sat alone as the sun dipped below the harbor. For the first time since the television autoplayed that recording, I allowed myself to feel something beyond strategy. Not rage, not grief. Respect. For her, for myself, the inheritance was never just money. It was responsibility. It was the authority to protect what generations had built. Daniel didn't just promise my assets. He promised my voice. And that was something I was no longer willing to surrender. I walked back into the living room and looked at the television where it had all begun. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with shouting. It arrives quietly. In paperwork. In amendments you're told are routine. In a husband smiling confidently because he thinks you will never hear the conversation that defines your future. But sometimes, the camera turns on at exactly the right moment. If you've ever been excluded from decisions about your own life, if someone tried to rewrite your inheritance, your marriage, or your future without your consent, if you were told you were overreacting when you were simply protecting what was yours, I want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. I read them. And I know there are more women who have faced betrayal disguised as stability. And if stories about inheritance, family drama, hidden manipulation, and tables turned speak to you, stay here. Subscribe. Stay connected. Because there are more stories where quiet promises get exposed, where control gets challenged, and where women stop signing documents just to keep the peace. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give away what was never theirs to take.